Racist cop slaps black teen in a store, unaware his dad owns the whole chain. Jamal Carter had spent most of his 17 years learning how to navigate a world that didn't always see him for who he was. He had been raised in privilege, but privilege had never shielded him from the assumptions people made the moment they laid eyes on him. He was the son of Anthony Carter, a man whose business empire stretched across the country, including a chain of high-end department stores. Yet, despite the wealth and influence that surrounded his family name, his father had always instilled in him the value of humility. To Anthony, money was not a shortcut to character. Success was not something to be inherited, it had to be earned. And so, unlike other children of the wealthy elite, Jamal attended a public school, worked summer jobs alongside kids who had no trust funds waiting for them, and lived a life that, from the outside, appeared far more ordinary than people would expect. But no matter how ordinary he tried to be, the world had a way of reminding him that he was different. Jamal had seen it in the subtle yet unmistakable shifts in body language when he entered certain spaces. The way strangers clutched their bags a little tighter, the way cashiers monitored his movements more closely than other customers, the way security guards seemed to materialize the moment he set foot inside a store. It was never overt, never explicit, but always there. A constant, unspoken message that his presence was being measured, scrutinized, and questioned. He had always believed that as long as he carried himself with dignity, as long as he avoided trouble and did everything right, he could rise above those assumptions. That belief, however, was put to the test one Saturday afternoon. The day had started like any other weekend, with Jamal heading out on his own, appreciating the brief solitude of his independence. Dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, he entered one of his father's department stores, a sleek, modern retail space with polished floors, high ceilings, and shelves meticulously arranged with the latest fashion and accessories. He had been to this store countless times before, but never as a recognizable figure. To the employees, to the customers, he was just another teenager browsing the aisles. And that was exactly what he wanted. The familiarity of the store was comforting. He moved leisurely, letting his eyes roam over rows of sneakers, his fingers grazing the smooth leather of a high-end brand that had just been released. Music played softly through his headphones, muting the sounds of conversations around him. He was in no hurry. This was supposed to be a moment of ease, a simple shopping trip. But then, as always, the feeling crept in, that quiet, gnawing sense of being watched. At first, he brushed it off. He had felt this before. It was an old, familiar tension, one he had learned to ignore. But as he continued moving through the store, the sensation didn't fade. It intensified. And when he glanced up from the sneakers, his eyes met those of a security guard standing across the store, watching him. Jamal recognized the look immediately. It wasn't curiosity or simple attentiveness. It was suspicion. A slow, simmering scrutiny that made his skin prickle. He sighed, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, forcing himself to remain composed. He hadn't done anything wrong. He was just shopping. But he knew better than to believe that mattered. Across the store, Officer Daniel Crowley narrowed his eyes, his posture stiff with authority. He had been with the police force for over a decade, and now, as a store security officer on his off days, he prided himself on his ability to spot trouble before it happened. And today, trouble had walked in wearing a hoodie, hands stuffed into his pockets, eyes darting over the merchandise like he was planning his next move. Crowley had seen this pattern before. He had dealt with it countless times. Kids who came in pretending to browse, only to slip something into their jackets the moment no one was looking. He had always trusted his instincts. His instincts told him this one was no different. Jamal pretended not to notice as Crowley took a few steps closer, but the weight of the officer's gaze bore down on him. He turned his attention back to the sneakers, lifting one from the display to examine it more closely. It was a habit now, acting normal, pretending he didn't notice the scrutiny, pretending it didn't get under his skin. But it did. It always did. He exhaled slowly, reminding himself that there was nothing to worry about. This was his father's store, after all. If he wanted to, he could walk straight to the counter and buy every pair of sneakers on the shelf without a second thought. But that wasn't the point. The point was that right now he wasn't Jamal Carter, son of Anthony Carter. He wasn't a name. He was just a face, just a teenager in a hoodie, and to men like Crowley, that was enough to make him a suspect. Crowley's grip tightened on his radio, though he didn't use it yet. He didn't need to. He had seen enough to know where this was going. The kid was lingering too long in one spot. His movements were too cautious, too calculated. Classic behavior. Crowley had learned to read people over the years, to spot the ones who were up to no good before they even knew it themselves. Jamal put the sneaker back and turned to another display, keeping his posture relaxed. He could feel his heartbeat quicken slightly, not with fear, but with frustration. No matter how many times this happened, it never got easier. He didn't want to acknowledge it, didn't want to give it power. But it was there, pressing against him like an invisible force, a reminder that, in moments like these, it didn't matter who he was. It only mattered who they thought he was. His father had warned him about this. Anthony Carter was a man who had built his empire from the ground up, who had faced these same assumptions long before Jamal was born. And he had taught his son how to handle them. Stay calm. Don't react. Don't give them a reason to escalate. But knowing all of that didn't make it any easier when it happened. It didn't stop the anger from bubbling beneath the surface, the quiet indignation of having to prove himself again and again just to exist peacefully in a space that should have welcomed him without question. Crowley continued watching, waiting. He had seen too many kids like this, had broken up too many fights, chased down too many thieves. He wasn't about to let this one slip through the cracks. He adjusted his stance, prepared to step in if necessary, because in his mind it wasn't a question of if, it was only a matter of when. Jamal continued browsing, but the sensation of being watched made it impossible to focus. The weight of suspicion pressed against him, invisible yet suffocating. He reached for a pair of sneakers, fingers tracing the fabric absently, but his mind was elsewhere. Across the aisle, Officer Crowley moved, his presence an unspoken warning. The man's posture was rigid, his gaze sharp, and his hand hovered near his belt in a way that made Jamal's stomach tighten. The space between them shrank. Crowley's voice cut through the store's ambient noise, sharp and accusatory, demanding an answer before a question had even been properly asked. Could he help Jamal with something? The words carried no real offer of assistance, only expectation, only pressure. Jamal hesitated. He had done nothing wrong, yet the familiar sting of being singled out burned through his chest. Just looking, he responded, forcing his tone to remain even, measured. Crowley didn't back off. His presence loomed closer, his words twisting the air into something hostile, something suffocating. Looking, or waiting for the right moment. The insinuation wrapped itself around Jamal like a vice, tightening with every syllable. Jamal frowned, confusion and irritation flickering through him. "Excuse me?" The response came naturally, but it did nothing to slow the officer's steady advance. "I know your type." Crowley's voice dropped lower, laced with quiet menace. "They come in, act casual, and then bolt with whatever they can grab. Not today." The accusation struck with the weight of something rehearsed, something practiced. Jamal felt the breath leave his lungs, felt the anger simmering beneath his skin. His fists clenched instinctively, but he forced himself to remain calm. He wasn't stealing. He had no reason to be treated this way. He was a customer, but that didn't seem to matter. That so? Crowley's smirk was thin, predatory. He stepped closer, a deliberate intrusion of space, an assertion of control. "Then why are you acting nervous?" The question was a trap, a game that Jamal had no way of winning. He opened his mouth to respond, to push back against the injustice pressing down on him. But before he could form the words, Crowley's hand clamped around his wrist. The grip was firm, unyielding. It carried authority, the kind that said there would be no argument, no negotiation. Crowley's command followed, sharp and immediate. "Empty your pockets." The order sliced through the moment, final and inescapable. Jamal's chest tightened. The air in the store felt heavier, charged with unspoken tension. A few other shoppers had begun to notice, their eyes flicking toward the unfolding scene, their whispers merging into the store's soft music. He could feel the shift, the quiet judgment settling over him like a shadow. If he resisted, he would be seen as aggressive. If he complied too easily, he would be seen as guilty. There was no right answer. I'm not emptying my pockets for no reason." He pulled back slightly, just enough to reclaim a fraction of space. But that was all it took. Crowley's expression darkened, a shift so sudden that it sent a ripple of foreboding through Jamal's gut. His authority had been challenged, and in that instant, the weight of that challenge came crashing down. Without hesitation, without warning, Crowley's hand snapped upward, his palm meeting Jamal's face with a crack that rang through the store. The slap sent Jamal staggering, his head snapping to the side, his cheek burning with the force of it. The stinging heat spread across his skin, an electric shock of pain and humiliation. Gasps rippled through the aisles, the quiet murmur of disbelief rolling outward like a wave. For a moment, everything blurred. The edges of his vision wavered, his thoughts tumbling over one another in a chaotic spiral of rage and disbelief. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not here, not to him. He had done everything right. He had kept his voice calm. He had not lashed out. And yet, here he stood, the sharp sting of Crowley's hand still radiating through his skin, the weight of 100 silent judgments pressing down on him. Then, from across the store, a voice cut through the suffocating silence. Deep, commanding, and filled with a quiet fury. "What on earth do you think you're doing?" The weight of the moment shifted, the air tightening with a different kind of tension. Jamal blinked, his vision clearing, his heartbeat loud in his ears. And in that instant, he knew the confrontation was far from over. Anthony Carter stood near the entrance, his broad frame still, his eyes locked onto the scene before him. Fury burned beneath his composed exterior, restrained but simmering dangerously close to the surface. He had come in for a routine visit, expecting nothing more than a check-in with his store manager, a brief walk through the polished aisles of his business empire. Instead, what he found was his son, being struck across the face by a man wearing his store's uniform. The sight had stopped him cold, rage curdling into something sharp and unrelenting. A father's instinct overrode everything else. The moment Crowley noticed Anthony striding toward him, something flickered in his expression. Confidence wavered, replaced by a split-second hesitation. He straightened his stance, schooling his features into forced authority. This was what he did best: control the narrative, take command. He addressed Anthony with the same tone he used to subdue suspects on the street, expecting compliance. The situation was under control, he assured him, his words measured but firm. There had been a suspicion, a need for intervention. This kid had been acting suspicious. Anthony barely allowed him to finish. "That kid is my son." The words landed like a hammer, a sudden shift in power that rippled through the store. A murmur rose among the onlookers, whispers threading through the stunned silence. Jamal, still reeling from the assault, blinked in disbelief as his father stepped between him and Crowley, a wall of unshakable resolve. The store, moments ago just another ordinary Saturday scene, had transformed into something charged, something heavy. Anthony's voice, though measured, carried an edge that sliced through the air like a blade. His son had been assaulted in his own establishment, by a man paid to uphold order. His son had been humiliated, presumed guilty, his dignity crushed under the weight of racial bias. Crowley faltered. His bravado cracked, revealing something beneath: panic, uncertainty. He stammered, attempting to backpedal, insisting he hadn't known. He had no idea. But the words tasted bitter even as they left his mouth. He had judged without evidence, acted without restraint. And now, his authority was slipping through his fingers, unraveling before a room full of witnesses. That he was my son? Anthony's voice did not rise, but the intensity of it silenced the room. So if he had been someone else's son, this would have been fine? The weight of that question suffocated the space between them. Crowley had no answer. There was none that wouldn't damn him further. The store manager, who had appeared as soon as the tension boiled over, looked visibly unsteady. This was no minor altercation. This was an earthquake that could shatter reputations, dismantle careers. He had seen Anthony Carter operate before, knew the kind of man he was, calm, composed, but utterly unforgiving when wronged. He fumbled for words, for damage control, but Anthony's raised hand cut him off before he could utter a sound. A verdict had already been passed. The directive was simple, final. Crowley would be fired immediately. And this wasn't going to end with one man's dismissal. No, this moment would send ripples through every corner of the store's operations. An internal review would be launched. No more unchecked authority. No more discrimination masquerading as security. This ended today. Crowley opened his mouth, a last-ditch effort to claw his way out, but the attempt withered before it could take shape. Security had already arrived, and in a poetic twist, the man who had spent years exerting control over others now found himself at the mercy of someone else's command. For the first time in his career, he was the one being escorted out, the weight of his actions trailing behind him like a specter. Jamal barely registered it. His father's presence had steadied him, but the aftershock of what had happened still coursed through his veins. The stinging imprint of the slap lingered on his skin, but worse was the humiliation, the sheer injustice of it. Anthony turned to him then, his gaze shifting from controlled fury to something gentler, something protective. Was he all right? The words, though softly spoken, carried more weight than anything that had just transpired. Jamal nodded, but inside, he was still shaking. That night, as the moon cast long shadows across the polished floors of their family's spacious home, Jamal sat in the quiet stillness of the living room, feeling the weight of the day settle into his bones. The events of the afternoon replayed in his mind, each moment sharpening in clarity now that the adrenaline had faded. He had always known racism existed, had been warned about it, had read about it, had seen it unfold in the news, but experiencing it so publicly, so violently, stripped away the abstract understanding he had carried for years. The sting of it was different now, more personal, more visceral. Across from him, Anthony Carter sat with his hands folded, his gaze heavy with unspoken thoughts. He had watched his son endure something he had spent a lifetime trying to protect him from, and the knowledge that he had failed gnawed at him. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and measured, carrying the weight of years of hard-earned wisdom. He wished he could shield Jamal from this reality, wished that money and success could be a barrier against prejudice, but the truth was far harsher. No amount of wealth, no level of achievement, could erase the way some people saw them. Jamal swallowed hard, the words striking something deep within him. He had spent his life believing that if he just did everything right, if he spoke properly, if he dressed well, if he avoided trouble, he could sidestep this ugliness. But today had shattered that illusion. He voiced his thoughts slowly, carefully, as if saying them aloud made them more real. His father listened, his expression unreadable, before exhaling a sigh laced with understanding. He had thought the same once, years ago, but experience had taught him otherwise. Today, Jamal had seen firsthand what countless others faced daily. He hadn't deserved what happened. No one did. A heavy silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of realization. Jamal's mind raced, threading together fragments of his father's past struggles with his own, drawing lines between their experiences in a way he never had before. He had always admired Anthony Carter's success, had seen him as a symbol of achievement, of proof that perseverance led to triumph. But now he understood the deeper fight beneath it all. This wasn't just about personal success. It was about dignity, about respect, about justice. His father's journey had never been solely about climbing the ladder. It had been about breaking barriers, about refusing to be diminished by a world that tried to place limits on him. The understanding settled into Jamal's chest, heavy yet illuminating. He looked at his father, truly seeing him for the first time, not just as a man of power, but as a man who had weathered storms most never even saw. And in that moment, he realized something profound. This wasn't the end of the story. It wasn't a closing chapter, a lesson learned and left behind. This was just the beginning. Because next time, he would be Rhea,